Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board and the Nebraska Soybean Board.
America's export of soybeans helps the U.S. maintain a positive agricultural trade balance. Nebraska contributes half of its soybeans for export. The protein and oil content in soybeans enhance the growing demand for higher protein diets. The Nebraska Soybean Board promotes research to develop new soybean varieties with higher protein and oil content for major agricultural markets. The Nebraska Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Market Journal, Television for Agricultural Business Decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board and the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, John Meuret analyzes corn and soybean markets. Brad Lubben updates us on ag trade opportunities. Tamra Jackson-Ziems explains how to keep stored grain in good quality. And John Wilson talks about soybean cyst nematode resistance. John Meuret from Meuret Grain Company is our market analyst this week. We talked with John Wednesday afternoon about selling strategies for corn and soybeans, the Federal Reserve's thoughts on interest rates, and the recent strength in the U.S. dollar.
Jeff, we haven't seen the move in the dollar like this in a long time, and I think we're at 12 or 13-year highs. The last time we had the dollar at these levels, corn was $2.30 and beans were $5, and so while the impact isn't immediate, it will be felt long-term. So certainly something to keep an eye on going forward here.
What's the effect on exports right now?
Well, we've seasonally will always slow down on soybean exports this time of year, and then corn slowly picks up. We're seeing that activity today. Anytime you start looking at currency moves, it takes a lot longer to see the effects in the export markets. So.
But corn has been strong, yes, in the export scene,
yes.
Correct? Because?
Part of it's seasonal. I mean, we've got export capacity. As these exporters wind down their bean loadings, they step back in and want to do something. You know, they don't want to take the next 6-7 months off, and so they're aggressive to sell corn. You know, there's some business we put on, and we need to. If we're going to export, 1.7 billion, we need to get to work at it. So
you mentioned the soybean export slowing down largely because of what's happening in South America. Do you have a sense of how big that crop is, or how big the market thinks that crop is?
It's a good question, and Brazil's trimmed back their forecast just a little bit from the northeast corner. Argentina is actually going to offset that plus some. They've had really good weather, so they've got an ample crop. The question still remains, when do they sell it? And the Argentine farmer has been able to hold them. You've seen the stories about the soybeans in bags. Eventually he has to go to market, and if he has this big of a crop, he's going to be forced to sell. So you
saw those stories on Market Journal, right? That's
of course,
the media you're referring to. Ethanol. Tell me where ethanol stands right now with how crude oil is still impacting it.
Well, I think ethanol's hanging in there. Margins are certainly tighter than they were a year ago. Currently, they can make a little bit of money, especially in Nebraska here. The offset happens to be the wet feed. Going forward's a question mark. We know we've got good stocks. We can probably export a little bit of ethanol. So the plants will stay running, Jeff, but probably not to the speed they were a year ago.
The stocks are still incredibly high, though. Yes.
Yes.
Tell me what the Fed decided. We're talking on Wednesday. The Fed has made a decision on what they're going to do with interest rates. They say what?
They're going to leave them unchanged until June. And so the market, I think, was leaning that direction. And so, after that report, I don't know that there's much difference. Soybeans and corn closed right after that report. Not a lot of impact there. So
update me on where basis is in your area of northeast Nebraska.
Basis is incredibly quiet, Jeff. We saw soybean basis pop a little bit after the first of the year and then quietly drift back down to more seasonal levels. Corn is really the same thing. We've had beautiful weather for about the last 10 days. That helps the farmer move the trucks down the road. So both of them, I would say, are about average, 20 to 30 under on the soybeans, and corn about in the same types of levels in northern Nebraska.
So what excites the corn market right now? It seems like it's been in this low. What makes it move?
Yeah, I think we're going to have to get a story, Jeff. And we look at beans. We hitched our wagon to the soybeans, and that crop has done well in South America. And so now we've got to find a new story. So I think that's part of the corn market's trouble is where are they going to hitch their wagon to? It's not going to be ethanol. We just talked about that. Probably not exports to a degree bigger than 100 or 200 million more bushels. So we have a problem. And when we have a gap now of information where there's really nothing new coming at us for about 30 days.
Do you have any targets that you're looking at old crop where you say for either corn or soybeans this is attractive, or based on what's happened this could be attractive?
Well, I think you have to adjust your sights on the corn, and I've been friendly corn myself, but as beans get tucked away and we continue to take that market lower, it becomes challenging for corn to move up on its own. So I think a guy needs to look real hard at $4 in the corn again, and when it gets there I think you have to sell. But I continue to think soybeans get closer to $8 than they do 10. So if my prediction's right on the soybeans, corn will be a sell if we can get to $4.
And 2015, what about that crop?
I think you've got to take the same approach that we talked about in the old crop. At the same time you're cleaning up old crop sales, reach to the new crop and sell some of those as well. So
for 2015 plantings, what is your assumption of what farmers will plant?
I think, Jeff, we're going to see more beans, and that's been a very popular idea the last 3 months, but the farmer's fed up with fertilizer prices. He's fed up with the input costs in general. I think he's going to kind of pull his head down in his shell and say, I'm going to do some soybeans. So we're starting to see that effects. I would expect that in North Dakota, South Dakota, and western Nebraska, these fringe areas will start to cut back corn production in a pretty big way.
Next week, Roy Smith will analyze corn and soybean markets, and Nebraska Extension livestock economist Kate Brooks will recap inventory numbers in the USDA's cattle report. New data from the 2012 Census of Ag shows Nebraska's 3rd Congressional District led all districts in the country for number of farms, total farm operators, and the market value of agricultural products sold during the year. The 3rd District runs from the west to the east, with a pocket cut out for Nebraska's 1st and 2nd Congressional Districts in the east. The 3rd District ranked 2nd in corn acres and 5th in soybean acres. Nebraska's 1st stood 12th in acres for corn and 10th for acres in soybeans. Late last year, President Barack Obama announced the U.S. would begin normalizing diplomatic relations with Cuba. Earlier this month, AgriPulse reported more than 30 farm groups and agribusinesses had launched a coalition to end a trade embargo and increase trade there. Nebraska Extension Public Policy Specialist Brad Lubben joined us Thursday to discuss ag trade opportunities in Cuba, as well as give an update on trade with Europe and Asia. We began by asking where Cuba stood on the agenda.
Well, it was interesting when the president announced plans to sort of reopen discussions with Cuba. It really is more about diplomacy than it is about trade, but it certainly highlighted the trade prospects as well. And there's some thought that it's not a big market. We wouldn't expect it to suddenly become a major destination for U.S. ag exports. But for some commodities, some basic staples, there's opportunity. And that might include some Nebraska commodities like dry beans that have already gone to Cuba.
How far away is that, though?
You can imagine it's several years away before you really develop the scale of a market that could be imagined. And that's if we really do proceed with sort of much more open relationships. Right now it's a promise to begin to bridge those relationships. We're a long ways away from expecting a major economic impact.
This week we heard some commodity groups talking about Trade Promotion Authority and wanting the president to have that ability. Tell me what Trade Promotion Authority is. Well,
really we can say the president's mention of Cuba and then his mention in the State of the Union address of the need for Trade Promotion Authority has really promoted trade to the forefront of some of the potential agenda here. The president might negotiate and continue and even finish negotiations in the Asia region with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He might continue negotiations in Europe with the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, but it's really difficult to finish those things if he doesn't have Trade Promotion Authority.
Which is what?
So what is it?
Yeah.
It effectively says Congress grants the administration authority to negotiate trade agreements and then reserves the right to vote them up or down. Without Trade Promotion Authority, the president could talk all he wants and even negotiate agreements, but any one of those agreements is really sort of subject to amendment and discussion and changes in Congress when Congress tries to pass it. If Congress can change it, then you're really not negotiating in full faith. It's hard to imagine any agreement really coming to fruition.
Does support follow along party lines for something like this?
It's rather interesting. The history of Trade Promotion Authority seems to be that Republicans won't trust a Democratic president with authority and Democrats won't trust a Republican president with authority. In this case, you might see a pro-trade primary Republican delegation in Congress that wants to move forward and is willing to walk with a Democratic president who's asking for that authority to move an agenda forward. You will have factions perhaps on both ends of the spectrum that aren't happy with the trade prospects or aren't happy with the authority going to this president, but if you can find enough support in the middle, you could imagine it moving.
You touched on this, but in Europe and Asia,
Right.
what potential opportunities
Right.
could it give? And just give me an update on what's happening
Yeah,
there.
those are the two big arenas for potential trade negotiations, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership is potentially huge as a block of trading nations. But the biggest obstacle remains discussions between the U.S. and Japan, and particularly about Japan's protections of some basic commodities, what they call their sacred commodities. Think of rice and beef and pork and wheat, a group of sacred commodities that have rather high tariffs that keep out U.S. product. If we're going to see an agreement, we're going to have to see some negotiation where Japan begins to open up those markets. There are other issues in Japan beyond agriculture as well. There are issues in Europe as well. Big agricultural issues such as hormones in meat production, genetically modified ag products and food products. What we call the geographical indicators, Europe's insistence on protection of place names in food brands as a trademark, even though those place names have become something of a generic definition for a food product. So lots of issues in both regions, lots of work yet to happen, but TPA certainly might move us further down the road.
We'll talk with Brad again in February to get a final look at Farm Bill options. Starting next week, you'll have the opportunity to attend one of 12 landlord tenant lease workshops across Nebraska. The meetings will be held at Grand Island on Wednesday and Blue Hill on Friday before moving on to other locations in the state. Nebraska Extension educator Alan Denalik says speakers will talk about land values, cash rents, the importance of communication, and types of leases between landlords and tenants.
The last thing we talk about is flex leasing. What are the options for setting up some type of a flex to the lease? Because as I'm visiting with landlords especially, what they're concerned about now is we have relatively lower commodity prices at this moment compared to a couple of years ago. So farmers are asking them to set their leases lower, and so they would consider that, except that they don't want to miss out on the next $5, $6, $7 corn crop or the $12, $15 bean crop, and so they're concerned about that. And so we're just trying to make sure we give them some options on how to set up a flex lease so they can capture those gains if we have them again in the market.
The Landlord Tenant Lease workshops are free to attend and sponsored by the Nebraska Soybean Board. More information on locations can be found on the Market Journal website. Because refreshments and handouts will be provided at each event, you're asked to register by calling the Nebraska Extension office in the appropriate county. In the January Nebraska Farmer, Nebraska Extension cow-calf specialist Carla Jenkins explains how limit feeding cow-calf pairs in confined lots may be a viable option for producers who want to expand their herds but can't access adequate grass. In this month's issue, Jenkins describes how confinement feeding can relieve grazing pressure on stressed pastures. You can read more about her recommendations in the January Nebraska Farmer. In 2014, Nebraska's farmers harvested more than 1.6 billion bushels of corn, the third largest haul in the nation behind Iowa and Illinois. As of December 1st, the state's producers were holding nearly 1.3 billion bushels of corn, with 780 million bushels stored on farms. As we move through winter months and into spring, Nebraska Extension plant pathologist Tamra Jackson-Ziems says those growers need to be keeping an eye on that grain. Increases in temperature can lead to condensation in a bin where grain can still be very cold. That added moisture can help promote mold growth, but Tamra says running fans can frequently help stabilize temperatures and prevent convection currents. We recently spoke with Tamra and began by asking her to describe the quality of Nebraska's corn as seen during the 2014 harvest.
Well, it really mattered what part of the state you're in as far as quality goes of the corn. In some parts of the state we had very high quality corn, but in some areas we didn't. Some of the quality was lagging behind.
And what was the reason for that?
Well, in some areas of the state we did have some ear rot issues. It's certainly not statewide. They were very isolated issues. And in fact, in some parts of the state we had corn that was prematurely killed last fall by frost.
Would those areas be problems that you would worry about as you talk about storing grain for a long period of time?
Well, certainly, a lot of people, once they harvest it and put it in the bin, it's out of sight and out of mind, and they forget that we really do need to continue to check and monitor the quality throughout the storage process, and particularly so if you were in a higher risk situation like with an ear rot disease and maybe some corn that may have been compromised by frost early.
Why do they cause problems for corn?
Well, in particular, if you have an ear rot disease, it's probably not a good idea to store it if you can avoid it at all. You should probably store the best quality corn and sell the rest of it. Ear rot diseases will turn into grain molds that will continue to grow in the bin, and so these fungi will grow throughout that corn and degrade it and make it less valuable, and it may lead to some dockage. And in other cases, corn that may have died prematurely due to frost, for instance, is more prone to ear rot diseases in general.
When we talk about quality, refresh for me what we actually mean when we say quality as we're using it today.
Well, when we talk about quality, you can see quality differences or indicators. For instance, sometimes the grain that is lower quality may have lower test weight. You may see discoloration on some of it. It might be an indication of starch and other components that are starting to, we think of spoilage and shelf life of grain, and certainly we need to think about that in the bin.
With shelf life, how much moisture can make a difference in terms of storing corn?
Moisture is critical. Temperature and moisture are both critical. The good news is very cold temperatures slow down degradation and damage caused by these fungi. But as we move toward spring and we start getting big fluctuations in temperature, we can have condensation develop in bins, and moisture is never good in the bin. And drying the corn further can help avoid further loss in quality. For instance, drying a single point difference, say going from 15% to 14%, can double the shelf life of corn.
If farmers have some corn left over from 2013, and hopefully there are very few of them, what are the recommendations for that grain?
Well, absolutely. I would think that would be a higher risk situation. Holding corn in storage for very long periods of time predisposes you to all kinds of damage, and not just ear rots, of course, insects and other things too. I would be very diligent about checking that especially.
On the Market Journal website, we'll link to more resources on grain storage management. In last week's episode of Market Journal, we talked about managing corn rootworm resistance with Nebraska Extension entomologist Bob Wright. This week, we look at resistance in soybean cyst nematodes with Nebraska Extension educator John Wilson. As we've told you before, Nebraska's farmers can submit soil samples for SCN analysis for free thanks to the Nebraska Soybean Board. UNL received nearly 1,200 samples this year, a new record and 9% above last year. Nearly 37% of this year's samples were positive for SCN, and Sherman County was added to the list of those with a presence for SCN. When we talked with John near Takema Wednesday, he said resistance in soybean cyst nematodes can be difficult to detect and challenging to control.
Well, over time the majority of our resistant varieties have used the same source of resistance. The reason for that is it was the easiest one to breed in and maintain yields, which is kind of the underlying factor on all of this. But because we use the same source of resistance for so long that a certain percentage of the population will reproduce on any source of resistance. There is no source that eliminates all reproduction, but what we want to do is try and minimize it. Because so many varieties have used the same source of resistance, those that have survived from that particular source of resistance, the PI 88788, that they have continued to multiply in fields to where we have populations that increase at levels higher than what we would like to see on a resistant variety.
If you have a field that does have SCN in it, how do you know if that is resistant?
Okay, what we recommend is for producers, even if they've sampled the field, they know what level of SCN that they had in their field initially. If they're using resistant varieties in combination with rotation with non-host crops, for most of folks around here, it'd be corn, that we encourage them to go back about 6 years later and resample those fields and see what the level is doing. Now, one thing that's important is if that initial sample was taken in the fall following soybeans, 6 years later, that it's important to go back in in the fall following soybeans, so it's the same cropping conditions. But then when they look at the egg counts in the soil, if they stayed about level or started to decline, that's what we're hoping for, that it's doing an adequate job of managing the population. On the other hand, if 6 years later when they sample it, all of a sudden it's a half again or twice as high or more, we know that we have a problem and we have a population that's overcoming that particular source of resistance that they've been using.
So we've talked about this before, but once you have SCN, you pretty much have it forever, right?
Yeah,
Is it once you have resistance, you also have that forever?
Well, yes, because what you're doing is you're selecting a fraction of the population that can overcome that source of resistance. It's no different than certain weeds becoming resistant to a particular herbicide, insects becoming resistant to a particular insecticide. We have nematodes that are becoming resistant or able to reproduce on a particular source of resistance. So what we recommend then is if a producer does have this situation, that there are several sources of resistance that are commercially available, and the seed companies are really making an effort to develop other resistant varieties utilizing these and still maintaining the yields. And so what a producer would need to do then would be look at scout out. It's going to be, right now it's a small percentage, less than 5%, probably less than 3% of the resistant varieties have one of these other sources of resistance. As time goes on and this problem expands, I look for there to be more resistant varieties with other sources of resistance. But find a good variety that has another source of resistance, use it in a year when you plant soybeans, and that way that it's a different selection pressure with a different genetic source of resistance.
Outside of crop rotation, are seed treatments effective in this case?
That we have not seen real good, consistent results with seed treatments, that we encourage producers to keep checking with them. The companies are looking at developing new sources of seed treatments. The one thing that we need to make sure that folks understand is that if you use a seed treatment, it does not take the place of genetic resistance, but it's used in conjunction with it, because a lot of times it may reduce that the reproduction in that first generation in the spring. That SCN reproduces about every 25 to 30 days depending on soil temperatures. So with a seed treatment we may eliminate that first generation, but there still will be SCN in the soil, and later on in the season we still need that genetic resistance in there from the resistant varieties to keep our populations in check.
John says if you haven't tested fields for soybean cyst nematodes before, it's a good idea to do so. And as we mentioned, it's free. You can visit your local Nebraska Extension office for a sample bag. Now with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension State Climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here again, once again, for the weekly forecast. And during this last week, of course, we had the very warm temperatures built into our region. And that was kind of a response to the blizzard that formed up in the northeastern United States, drove a deep trough across the eastern United States, and subsequently the ridge pushed much farther north. And let's face it, the model way underplayed the degree of warmth. What was looking like mid-60-degree readings ended up turning up in the middle of the week to 70-degree readings, and several records were set across the state in regards to warmest January and, of course, warmest day that had occurred during the time frame for the date in question. Now, we've seen a cold front move through that brings some slightly cooler weather into our region during the latter half of the week, and now we have this storm system moving up from the southwest that's going to interact with the northern jet stream and produce a wide swath of precipitation from the south central plains up through Nebraska. Let's take a look at the upper air forecast and see how this will play out. Here's our northern stream energy, and here's that deep upper air low across the southwest that's pulling Gulf moisture at the surface into our region, and in the mid layers of the atmosphere pulling that Pacific moisture up into the central plains, which will interact with this front. So we'll see an overrunning precipitation event today. It basically starting out as rain, and as the day progresses, this cold air will start to funnel in from north to south, and we should see a change over to rain snow as we go through the day, and as we get into the evening, looks like an all snow event for south central southeast Nebraska, where we'll see the greatest accumulations. Right now the quantitative precipitation forecast for this event is indicating anywhere from a half an inch to an inch across south central southeast Nebraska, about a quarter to a half inch up into northeastern Nebraska, but the far western 1/3 of the state, nothing is expected in terms of precipitation. Now, as we get to tomorrow, this cold air will start to really infiltrate into the region, pushing most of the energy across the Ohio River Valley, so we should see a fairly good swath of snow from Iowa to points eastward. The precipitation will come to an end here in Nebraska, and we'll, of course, have to deal with colder temperatures. We will start to see some warming trying to build into the region as the ridge starts to try to rebuild and this system exits off the eastern seaboard, but it'll be very cool across the northeast and east central Nebraska. And as we go into Tuesday, we'll see some moderation across western Nebraska, but it looks like another front will try to push through. We might see some flurries breaking out late Tuesday, and more importantly, as we get into Wednesday, it looks like our best opportunity for flurry activity, but it doesn't look like any significant snowfall as the cold air kind of shifts off toward the eastern Great Lakes. And once again, we start to see some ridging pattern trying to build back up into the central Rockies, and we'll start to see more of that occurring as we get into Thursday with yet another wave coming through that may generate some light snowfall across extreme northeastern Nebraska. By the time we get to Friday, we'll see that ridge building back in, and much warmer temperatures look like they're going to invade the central United States. So as we look at this temperature forecast, we are looking at the worst of the climate conditions this weekend with primarily a rain-snow mix across southeast, east central, and south central Nebraska, changing to all snow during the overnight hours. Then we'll see the cold air lock in on Monday and Tuesday before another system moves through on Wednesday, and then we'll see a gradual warming of temperatures. Now, as we go to the 8 to 14-day forecast that takes us through from Thursday through next Tuesday, we'll see that ridge starting to build into our region. And in terms of precipitation, with that ridge, we would expect a shut-off of any significant moisture.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews can be found on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on corn and soybean markets, ag trade, grain storage quality, and soybean cyst nematodes resistance. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Next week, Roy Smith will analyze corn and soybean markets, and Kate Brooks will recap the USDA's report on cattle inventory. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board and the Nebraska Soybean Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board and the Nebraska Corn Board.
When we transform Nebraska corn into ethanol, it doesn't disappear from the food supply. It just takes a little detour. Ethanol is made from the starch. The rest of the corn becomes livestock feed to create meat and dairy products, corn oil, sweetener, and other food ingredients, and maybe a little carbon dioxide to make your soft drinks fizzy. Homegrown ethanol helps satisfy America's hunger for energy and the world's appetite for feed and food. Nebraska's family corn farmers, sustaining innovation.